May 1803, Dunbar Creek, St. Simon's Island, Georgia. A small ship carrying roughly 75 newly purchased captives moves through the marsh water toward a plantation dock. The people on board had just survived the Middle Passage. They had just been sold at auction in Savannah. And now, in the final miles of their forced journey, something happens that no overseer's ledger was prepared for. The captives rise up. They overpower the crew. 3 sailors die in the struggle. The ship runs aground in the marsh. And, according to the earliest written account, left behind by a nearby overseer named Roswell King, the people did not scatter and did not surrender. They walked into the water of Dunbar Creek, still wearing their iron shackles, and did not come back out. At least 10 of them drowned that day by choice, rather than step onto the plantation waiting for them on shore. For more than a century afterward, this story was treated by historians as folklore, a legend passed down through Gullah oral tradition and dismissed as exaggeration. Then, starting in the 1980s, researchers went back through the archives, cross-checked shipping manifests, plantation correspondence, and court records, and confirmed that the mass drowning at what became known as Igbo Landing actually happened. This was not a myth invented to comfort grieving descendants. It was documented, verified, historical fact. And the people who did it were not a random assortment of enslaved Africans. Every single one of them belonged to one specific ethnic group, funneled out of one specific river delta in what is now southeastern Nigeria. They were Igbo. And what happened at Dunbar Creek was not an isolated act of desperation. It was the visible tip of a much larger, much stranger story, one that historians are only now piecing back together, and one that a huge number of Black Americans are about to discover sitting quietly inside their own DNA. For most of American history, the transatlantic slave trade has been taught as a single undifferentiated tragedy. Millions of people, stripped of names, stripped of nations, stripped of any thread that could be traced back to where they came from. That is the version most people grew up with. A void where identity used to be, an unrecoverable blur across too many ships and too many centuries. But that version leaves out a number that should stop anyone in their tracks. Before going further, it helps to understand who the Igbo actually were before any of this happened to them, because the popular imagination tends to flatten every enslaved African into the same faceless category. And that flattening is itself part of how this story stayed hidden for so long. The Igbo were never a single centralized kingdom with one king and one capital the way European observers expected African societies to be organized. They were, and largely still are, a decentralized cluster of city-states, village federations, and title-based societies spread across what is now southeastern Nigeria, bound together by shared language, shared religious cosmology, centered on a supreme creator called Chukwu, and dense networks of trade, kinship, and titled societies like the Ozo. That decentralization is exactly why European traders on the coast could never simply negotiate with a single Igbo ruler for captives the way they sometimes could further along the coast. Instead, the flow of enslaved people out of Igbo territory ran largely through a separate trading power on the coast itself, the Aro Confederacy, an Igbo trading network built around a powerful oracle at Arochukwu, which extended credit, controlled trade routes into the interior, and funneled captives. Taken through raids, warfare, judicial punishment, and debt, down to the coastal ports of Bonny, Calabar, and New Calabar, where British ships were waiting. Understanding that machinery matters because it explains how a decentralized people without a single throne to topple could still be extracted in such staggering concentrated numbers over more than a century. Historians who study the Bight of Biafra, the West African coastal region that includes what is now southeastern Nigeria, have pieced together a demographic pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Of the roughly 1.7 million people forced out of that region across the entire era of the Atlantic slave trade, researchers estimate that as many as 1.3 million of them were Igbo. That is not a minority swept up alongside other groups. That is the overwhelming majority of an entire regional trade, concentrated in one people, funneled through a handful of ports, most notably Calabar and Bonny on the Niger Delta, and loaded onto ships bound overwhelmingly for one destination above all others in British North America: Virginia. This is where the story stops being about West Africa and starts being about the foundations of the United States. Virginia did not receive a random cross-section of enslaved people from across the continent. Historian Douglas Chambers, who spent years reconstructing shipping and plantation records for his book on the subject, found that of roughly 37,000 Africans documented arriving in Virginia from the Calabar region during the 1700s, close to 30,000 were Igbo. Other researchers, including the historian David Eltis, estimate that between 30 and 45% of all captives brought into Virginia came from the Bight of Biafra, and that as many as 80% of those were specifically Igbo. The Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia has put the Bight of Biafra share of Virginia's total slave imports at around 38%. In parts of the 18th century, in the Tidewater and Piedmont regions of the colony, Igbo people made up more than 30% of the entire enslaved population. Some historians have gone so far as to nickname colonial Virginia Igbo Land, not as a poetic flourish, but as a demographic description backed by the paperwork. To put those numbers into a wider frame, historians estimate that across the entire 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, something on the order of 12 to 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas, drawn from an enormous stretch of coastline running from present-day Senegal down through Angola. Against that backdrop, a single delta region supplying 1.3 million captives, concentrated overwhelmingly into one destination colony, is not a proportional slice of a continent-wide tragedy. It is an anomaly, a demographic bottleneck that historians are still trying to fully explain, and one that becomes even stranger once you realize how young most of those captives were. Ship manifests and plantation inventories from the period repeatedly describe Igbo captives as disproportionately children. Adolescents and young adults, a pattern some historians connect to the internal mechanics of the Arrow trading network, which often extracted people through debt bondage and judicial sentencing rather than large-scale warfare, producing a captive population skewed younger than trade out of some other regions of the coast. Sit with what that actually means. When historians talk about the earliest formation of American slave society, the Chesapeake tobacco economy, the plantation culture that would eventually define the antebellum South, they are describing, in large part, the forced transplantation of one specific West African civilization onto American soil, in numbers dense enough to shape that culture from the ground up. Chambers described this process with a term of his own, calling it Igboization, the slow, forced, and largely unacknowledged transformation of early African American culture around an Igbo foundation. That is not a footnote in the story of Black America. That is closer to a rewriting of its origin point. And the concentration was not a brief historical accident that faded after one generation. It was sustained across decades, dense enough that its effects rippled forward for centuries. After years spent in the archives, Chambers arrived at a claim that is almost impossible to fully absorb on first hearing it. He has stated that his research suggests perhaps 60% of Black Americans today carry at least one Igbo ancestor. 60%. In a country where the popular understanding of African American ancestry has always been that it is functionally unrecoverable, too many ports, too many ships, too many centuries of deliberately erased paperwork, one historian's archival reconstruction points to a majority of Black Americans carrying a direct, traceable line back to a single specific West African people. That is not background noise lost in static. That is a signal running straight through 300 years of silence, and it shows up in more than genealogy charts. Researchers have traced funeral customs, spiritual practices, patterns of community organization, and methods of quiet resistance among enslaved communities in the Chesapeake, back to identifiable Igbo cultural frameworks that survived because there were simply too many Igbo people packed too densely, generation after generation, for slaveholders to fully erase what they brought with them. The word okra, now a staple of southern cooking, comes directly from an Igbo language root, carried across the ocean along with the plant itself as an enslaved substitute for a West African staple crop. The use of certain drum patterns, certain call and response structures in early Black religious music, certain naming conventions found in colonial slave records, all of it has been traced by researchers back to specific Igbo antecedents. This is not scattered coincidence. This is structure, hiding in plain sight inside a culture that was never supposed to remember where any of it came from. There is a specific irony sitting inside all of this that most retellings skip entirely. Igbo religious and social life, back in the homeland, was built around individual achievement, titled Societies a Person Earned Through Effort and Community Standing, and a cosmology in which a person's fate was bound up with a personal spiritual force called chi, something close to an individual destiny that could be negotiated with, honored, or defied. That is about as far as you can get from the plantation system's entire logic, which depended on erasing individual identity and replacing it with pure, fungible labor. Historians studying the Chesapeake have argued that this specific cultural mismatch, of people whose entire worldview emphasized personal agency and spiritual autonomy, dropped into a system engineered to strip both away completely, helps explain why colonial records so consistently single out Igbo captives for both stubborn resistance and, more disturbingly, unusually high rates of suicide relative to other groups documented on the same plantations. Planters wrote about it themselves, often with a mixture of frustration and something close to superstition, describing enslaved Igbo people as prone to what they called melancholy, and prone to what they saw as an unwillingness to be broken into submission the way they expected. Once you understand that structure, the reputation attached to Igbo captives in colonial records starts to make a different kind of sense. Planters wanted Igbo labor because the Bight of Biafra had become a brutally efficient, steady supply line for the slave trade, run largely through Bristol and Liverpool merchant houses that dominated that stretch of coast. But planters also feared what they repeatedly described in their own letters and account books as Igbo rebelliousness, a reputation for resistance, for refusal, for a documented pattern of enslaved Igbo people choosing death over submission that appears again and again across colonial sources from Virginia down through the Carolinas and into Georgia. That reputation is not a myth invented after the fact by nervous slaveholders trying to explain their own losses. It has a name, a date, and a location, and it is exactly the story this video opened with. Dunbar Creek, May 1803, St. Simon's Island. For descendants along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, particularly within Gullah Geechee communities, the mass drowning at Igbo Landing was never treated as simply a horror story to be buried and forgotten. It became something closer to a sacred narrative, retold, sung, and eventually formally commemorated. Oral tradition transformed the drowning into what became known as the myth of the Flying Africans, the belief that the souls of those who died at Dunbar Creek did not simply die, but grew wings, or turned into vultures, and flew back across the ocean to freedom, because a soul that chooses its own ending cannot be owned by anyone. Roswell King's contemporary account, the earliest written record of the event, is one of the very few sources historians have from the time, and modern archival research conducted since the 1980s has confirmed the factual core of what oral tradition preserved for nearly 200 years before anyone with institutional authority took it seriously. In 2002, descendants organized a 2-day commemoration at the site, drawing roughly 75 attendees from across the United States, as well as from Nigeria, Brazil, and Haiti, deliberately mirroring the number of Igbo captives believed to have been on that ship. They designated the site as holy ground. And in 2022, the Coastal Georgia Historical Society finally installed an official historical marker at Dunbar Creek, more than 2 centuries after the event, inscribed with a saying attributed to the Igbo people themselves, that the water brought them there and the water would take them away. Igbo Landing was not, in fact, an isolated event, even within its own decade, though it is by far the most famous. Historical and folkloric accounts from the same period reference other, less documented instances of enslaved Africans along the Georgia and South Carolina coast choosing collective drowning over plantation life, and Gullah Geechee oral tradition preserved multiple regional variations of the flying African story, some naming specific plantations, some naming specific individuals who were said to have simply risen into the air and vanished rather than picked up a hoe. Nobel laureate Toni Morrison drew directly on this tradition for the ending of her novel Song of Solomon, and the folklorist Virginia Hamilton built an entire collection of Black American folk tales around the flying Africans myth, introducing it to generations of American school children who often had no idea the story traced back to one specific, documented, verifiable act of mass resistance carried out by one specific West African people on one specific morning in 1803. The story did not stay confined to Georgia history museums and regional folklore. It surfaced again in the 21st century inside mainstream American pop culture, most visibly in Beyoncé's Lemonade, in a sequence where Black women walk together into open ocean water, a moment that critics and cultural historians have directly connected back to Dunbar Creek. A specific act of mass resistance carried out by a specific West African ethnic group in 1803 is still shaping the visual language of American culture today. That is not a closed chapter. That is a live wire running from a colonial marsh straight into a streaming platform. So why isn't any of this common knowledge? Why doesn't the 60% figure show up in standard American history classrooms? Part of the answer is structural, and it is the same structural reason so much of African American genealogical history stayed buried for so long. Enslavers stripped names on arrival at American ports. They renamed people, broke apart families deliberately to prevent organizing, and destroyed or simply never created the kind of paper trail that could have preserved specific ethnic origin for most enslaved individuals. For the vast majority of American history, tracing a specific African ethnicity back to a specific living family was treated as functionally impossible. That assumption, repeated for generations, hardened into its own quiet form of erasure, not just of names, but of the very idea that reconnection to a specific origin might ever be possible again. It is also worth pausing on just how recent the idea of Igboland itself has been in the modern political sense, because it adds another layer to why this history stayed so quiet for so long. In the 20th century, the same southeastern Nigerian homeland that once fed the Bight of Biafra slave trade became the center of an entirely different tragedy. When the region attempted to secede from Nigeria in 1967 as the Republic of Biafra, triggering a brutal 3-year civil war and a famine that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people, most of them Igbo civilians, before the secession collapsed in 1970. That war pushed the word Biafra back into global headlines for a few devastating years, and then let it fade from Western memory almost as quickly, which meant that by the time DNA testing companies began building out African reference panels decades later, most American customers had no cultural context at all for what a Nigerian or Biafran ancestry result was even connected to, historically or emotionally. The DNA industry, in a real sense, has been reintroducing an entire hidden chapter of history to people one saliva sample at a time, with almost no institutional scaffolding around it to explain what they are looking at. That assumption is now being dismantled in real time, and this is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Commercial DNA testing has begun doing, at scale, something historians spent 2 centuries unable to do at all. It is handing back specific, personalized answers to individual families. Consumer genetics companies have built out dedicated African ancestry initiatives specifically to expand their reference populations for African American customers, adding substantially more genetic data from Nigeria and other West African nations so that someone spitting into a tube in Atlanta or Chicago can, for the first time in their family's American history, see a country, and in a growing number of cases, a specific ethnic region, attached to a fragment of their own genome. Major ancestry testing databases now hold tens of millions of samples, generating an enormous volume of genetic matches connecting distant relatives who had no prior knowledge of each other's existence. What used to be an unanswerable question for an entire people is now, for a rapidly growing number of individual families, something that can arrive in an email. There's also a quieter, more personal side effect of this DNA revolution that rarely makes headlines. Since the 1990s, waves of Igbo immigrants have settled across the United States for entirely separate reasons, pursuing education and economic opportunity, building communities in cities like Houston, Atlanta, and New York. For decades, those two populations, descendants of the enslaved and recent voluntary immigrants from the same homeland, largely moved through American life without any formal awareness of their deeper connection. Now, DNA matches are quietly linking distant cousins across that exact divide, occasionally connecting a Nigerian-born immigrant family with an African-American family whose ancestors left the same region on a slave ship 2.5 centuries earlier. Genealogists working in this space describe these encounters as some of the most emotionally intense moments in modern DNA research. 2 branches of the same family tree meeting again, after a separation that history itself had insisted was permanent. But here's the part the marketing rarely mentions, and it matters. The answers coming back are messier and stranger than a viral headline wants them to be. Some families receive a large, confident Nigerian percentage on an early test, only to watch that number shift substantially when the company updates its reference panel a year or 2 later, reallocating what used to read as broadly Nigerian into narrower regional categories, or shifting it toward neighboring Bantu-linked populations as the underlying comparison data improves. Genetic ancestry estimates are not a fixed photograph taken once and settled forever. They are closer to an ongoing negotiation between imperfect, still-growing reference databases and the genuinely messy, centuries-long migratory reality of real human history. Large genome-wide studies of African American populations have found average ancestry proportions sitting around 73% African, 24% European, and under 1% Native American, though individual results vary enormously, with some people identifying as African American, carrying well under 10% West African ancestry, and others carrying well over 90, depending entirely on their specific family history. The European ancestry embedded in that average genome is itself a quiet, permanent record of centuries of forced and coerced mixing under slavery, a genetic residue that DNA testing surfaces whether a family wants to see it or not. The story DNA tells is real. It is not simple, and it does not arrive packaged the way a headline wants it to. This is also where the deeper, harder truth in this story needs to be said plainly instead of dressed up. Some corners of the internet have taken the genuine, well-documented Igbo-American historical connection and pushed it somewhere the actual evidence does not go, toward claims that Igbo genetics prove a lost tribe of Israel bloodline, that DNA testing has confirmed an ancient Hebrew lineage running directly through southeastern Nigeria and into Black America today. This belief is real, and it matters deeply to many of the people who hold it. It has genuine roots inside long-standing Igbo oral tradition and religious identity, tied to older claims of descent through biblical figures, but mainstream population genetics does not support that specific claim as an established scientific finding, and Nigerian historians and scholars themselves have pushed back firmly against the genetic version of the argument, calling it exactly what the evidence shows it to be, which is unsupported. The real documented story does not need that kind of embellishment to be extraordinary. It is already extraordinary on its own terms. The true legacy here is not a mythical bloodline stretching back to the ancient Near East. It is something far more immediate and far more American than that. It is the fact that one specific West African people, funneled by the tens of thousands into one specific American colony, in numbers large enough to reshape that colony's culture from the inside out, went on to become, quietly and without acknowledgement, one of the primary genetic and cultural foundations of Black America itself. It is the fact that a word for a vegetable, a rhythm carried through generations of music, a funeral custom, a documented reputation for defiance, and a 200-year-old story about souls flying home over open water are not separate curiosities scattered across unrelated corners of American culture. They are pieces of the same buried architecture, still quietly holding up a culture that was never allowed to see its own blueprint. And the story is still actively moving. Genealogists and DNA researchers are continuing to refine these estimates as reference databases expand and as more archival shipping and plantation records get digitized and cross-referenced against slave ship manifests that once seemed permanently silent. Descendant communities from Nigeria, Haiti, and across the diaspora still make pilgrimages to Dunbar Creek, gathering to pour water, sing, and mark ground that official American history spent 2 centuries barely mentioning. New documentaries and research projects continue to reopen the subject, both as a wound and as an act of reclamation happening at the same time. And ordinary families are still opening consumer DNA reports and discovering, sometimes for the first time in their entire lives, a name attached to a piece of themselves they had been told, implicitly or explicitly, simply did not exist anymore. So the real question at this point is not really whether the Igbo shaped early Black America. Among the historians who have spent careers reconstructing this record, that evidence is no longer seriously contested. Between the shipping manifests out of Calabar and Bonny, the demographic concentration documented in colonial Virginia, the cultural fingerprints preserved in food, music, and funeral practice, and the growing weight of consumer DNA data connecting living families back to specific West African regions, the outline of the story is clear. The real question is what happens next, as reference databases keep improving, as more descendants test their own DNA, as more archival records get digitized and cross-checked against sources that once seemed permanently lost to history. How many more of these buried demographic truths are still sitting quietly inside plantation ledgers and Bight of Biafra shipping records, waiting for someone to finally connect the dots between a name on a manifest and a family alive today? How many more families will open an ancestry report over the next 5 years and discover that the blank space they were always told was unfillable actually had a name written into it the entire time? And if something close to 60% of Black Americans really do carry Igbo ancestry, a number that has stayed largely invisible for more than 2 centuries, the harder question is what else has been sitting in that same silence, waiting still to surface.